Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you might be joining us. Welcome to the Purpose and Beyond podcast. I'm your host, Kelly R. Jackson. Let's just get right into it as we always do. It's time for our Monday morning discipleship. Monday morning discipleship, as always, we like to come on Monday, try to give you something to supplement what you may have heard on Sunday morning. Before we get back into our series, we'll give you our announcement as we always do. If you enjoy what we do here on the Purpose and Beyond podcast, we invite you to consider becoming a sponsor of this podcast. You can do so by visiting www.patreon.com/purpose and beyond. Check out the different levels of sponsorship that we do offer, some as little as $5 a month. Again, we offer exclusive content and merchandise at select levels. We do this as a labor of love and extension of our ministry, but a little support will go a long way to support the hours of work that it takes to bring you podcasts and videos throughout the week. So listen, if you'd like to become a sponsor of this podcast, you can do so by visiting www.patreon.com/purpose and beyond. Check out how you can do that. If you don't want to do the entire Patreon thing, you can always just sow into this ministry. You can do so by visiting www.krjministries.org/donate to check out how you can just sow into the ministry. And we would definitely appreciate any level of support that you give us. We would definitely appreciate you for doing that. As we like to say, however you choose to bless us, we will be satisfied in Jesus' name. Let's get back into our series, Isolation for Elevation. This is part 10. Y'all forgive me if I'm wrong. I do believe this is part 10 of Isolation for Elevation. Very quickly before we get into that, though, let me remind you all that we've got 2 more podcasts before the summer comes. And so we're going to be taking a little hiatus for the months of July and August. For the months of July and August, there will be no podcast. Again, we have some things that we have to get taken care of, some infrastructure things in relation to the church. So we're going to be taking a little bit of time off so that we can get those things in order. So for the months of July and August, there will be no Purpose and Beyond podcast. Again, we may pop in every now and then and give you a Wisdom Wednesday here and there, but we're going to be taking some time off. We're not just taking time off here, we're also taking time off from our radio broadcast as well, so that we can give proper attention. And I promise you, we're going to come back strong in the fall. And so I just want to make sure I reminded you all of that. Again, let's get back into this series. We're going to try not to be long today because we're winding down. We got 2 more installments of the series. So this is part 10. I had to go back and look through my notes here. This is part 10, Isolation for Elevation, taking a long walk with God. And so what we're going to do over these next couple of podcasts, again, this may actually be a shorter podcast than we have been doing recently. Usually we go on all the way past 30 minutes. We may get right up next to 30 minutes, but what we're doing right now and what I want to share with you over these last couple of installments of this particular series, and I pray that you have been blessed by the series. If you're catching us in the middle of the series, please go back and check it out and check out the other episodes. I believe you'll be blessed by it. But what we want to do is want to prepare you all to come out. And so as we talk about being isolated, talk about going into the wilderness, so we want to get you prepared to come out. So we want to get you to a place where you're prepared that after you come out of the wilderness, after God has done all that he's going to do in the way of isolation and consecration and those things, we want to get you to prepared to come out, because eventually you got to come out of that place and you got to come out into something. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. We don't have any scripture on today. We don't even have any excerpts from the book. I just got notes today. And next week, though, I will have some scripture for you. We've already got next week's podcast planned out for you, but I have some scripture on next week. But tonight is the recording of this podcast, or whenever you're watching, whether it's on the video side, wherever you're listening, we're going to have some notes on today. And so I want to talk to you again about coming out of this place of isolation and really kind of going back. And I told you in so many of these episodes before we get to the first note on today, that God sometimes isolates us and he consecrates us for service, but he'll often send us back to the place that he called us out from. But he sends us back different, and he sends us back new. And so let's talk about this. The first note I have on today, and I told you we're going to try not to be that long on today. The first note I have here is coming out of isolation can be more challenging than going in. Coming out of isolation can be more challenging than going in. And so as we talked and as we've talked over these, the first 9 installments of this series, this is number 10, we talked about how difficult it can be sometimes when God says, I got to pull you away. I got to take you out of some of the things that you know. I got to take you away from some of the people that you know, because I want to consecrate you. I want to get you cleaned up for service. Again, as we've said, sometimes God says, I'm going to send you back. But we talked about how difficult that can be at times, because the truth of the matter is sometimes God is pulling us away from friends and family and church family, maybe pulling you away from coworkers. He's pulling you out of the places that you have become comfortable, but maybe it's not where you're supposed to be. How many of you know that we can be comfortable in wrong? We can be comfortable in bad situations, in bad scenarios. We can find ourselves settled in places that God says you should be unsettled here. You shouldn't be so comfortable here. And so even as God pulls you out, it can be difficult. But I want you to know that coming out of isolation, coming out of that period where you've been by yourself with God, it can sometimes be more difficult than actually going in. Why do you say that? One of the things that'll happen to you when you're coming out of isolation, next note here, is you'll see people, circumstances, and even yourself differently. One of the things that I've always told people about salvation, about being saved, about becoming saved, is, we often, we make all these euphemisms and say all these things about being saved and my hands look new and all of this other stuff. And the reality of the situation is sometimes that doesn't really happen. Sometimes you're not, when you become saved. In fact, most times when you become saved, you don't instantly just transport to somewhere else and start living with different people. You may still have the same spouse. You have the same siblings. You have the same coworkers. Have the same people that you're around, people in the neighborhood. And one of the things I've often told people about being saved is I say one of the things that happens is not so much that you're looking at yourself and your hands look new and all that good stuff. I said, but your eyes are open. So when we come to a place where we're saved, we come to a place we realize we need to be saved. Right? You can't really be saved unless you feel the need to be saved. I'm drowning. I'm dying here and I need somebody to help me. And I said, one of the things that happens when we become saved is our eyesight, our vision and everything starts to change and we start to see things differently. So when you really become saved and you start looking at your life, you start examining yourself and you say, I used to do this all the time. This is wrong. I shouldn't have been doing this. You start looking at the people that you used to run with. You say, hey, man, you are enabling me. Yeah, we were running in this together, but I can't run this. I'm starting to see how you may not be good for me. I'm starting to see how this job may not be the best place for me. Listen, I got that testimony, and I got to talk about that in my book, Where's My Change? I said, when God really started doing the work on me, I had to quit a job because the job was bringing out the worst in me. God says, no, I'll give you. By the way, he put me in another job, but he said, this job has been terrible and it's been terrible for you. But now that you're seeing things differently, and by the way, I didn't become saved on the job, but I really tapped into what God wanted me to see. But anyway, you'll see when you come out of this isolation period, you'll see people differently. You'll see circumstances differently. And you'll even see yourself differently. And sometimes that can be difficult, y'all. When you start to examine yourself, which you kind of should be doing in your period of isolation, but you start to examine yourself and you say, man, there's some things you need to change. Let me take it a step further. When you start to examine your behavior, you say, you know what? I always thought them people were bad for me, but there were some cases where I was bad for them, that I was no good for them. And so you start to see yourself differently. When you're coming out and you're coming out as a new person, you do see yourself differently now. And you say, okay, now that I see myself, now that I've spent this time with God, now that I've been isolated, now that I've been consecrated and God has cleaned me up, now I realize that I cannot be everywhere. That I can't, if I can be very churchy right now, that I can't dwell everywhere. That everybody can't hang around me, that everybody can't come to the house, that I need to watch the company that I keep. I don't have to completely cut people off. I don't have to be completely antisocial, but I got to be careful about where I spend my time. And so when you're coming out and you start to see circumstances, you start to see other people differently, this can be a challenge because, again, y'all, when we come out of the world and we come into salvation, some of the very people that you love and revere, you start to see them differently. You go, man. One of the things I'll say this very quickly before I move on to the next note. One of the things that I've said about racism, I said that part of the reason that racism is a challenge to get rid of, outside of the fact that some people want to keep it in place, part of the reason that racism is a challenge, particularly for people that don't look like me, if we're going to be real about it, part of the reason that racism is a challenge for some white people to get past is because they have to look at some of their family members differently. And listen, and I'm saying this to you again as a black man. I don't propose that that's easy. I think sometimes we oversimplify and say you just got to stop. And it's like, yeah, you do have to stop, but man, I have to deal with the fact that some of my family members feel this way. Some of my family members are harboring these feelings. And so the same thing happens, y'all. We come out of this isolation place that you see people differently. Again, you see circumstances differently. And then you see yourself differently. Again, as you're going into isolation, you see where you need to be better. You see where you need to change. But as you're coming out, you're saying, there's some places I just can't go anymore. But there are people there that I love. So it can be challenging. Next thing, y'all. Next thing. You got to be sure not to lose your footing. This is why it's difficult coming out of this isolation period where God sets you in a different place, where he sets you on different ground. You have to make sure that you don't lose your footing, that you don't lose your progress. Again, I encourage you all, and I'm not trying to sell a book here, but I encourage you all, if you have not checked out my book, Where's My Change? This kind of things, one of the things I talk about, where I said, don't lose your footing. When you come out and you're that new person that you change, don't lose where you were. Don't lose the progress that you've made. And so when you're coming out, you got to make sure that you don't lose your footing. As we talk about God putting us on solid ground, don't you mess around and lose your footing. Don't you mess around and lose your progress. Next set of notes here, then move on here, because I told y'all we're going to try to be out of here quick on today. Next thing. Your surroundings may be familiar, but you will still need to reacclimate. So again, as we talk about coming out of this isolation place, and I said to you, in most cases, God sends us back. He sends us back. Go back to those people. And I'll talk to you about that a little bit later here. There's another note here. Actually, it's the next note here. I won't get ahead of myself. Even though you're going back to places that you're familiar with, you still need to get reacclimated. Why do I need to be reacclimated? Because you're not the same anymore. So again, this isn't like you just being a duck going back into the water. You're different now. And so you got to get reacclimated, which means that I got to see my surroundings for what it is and not what I wanted it to be before. I got to see it with a new set of eyes and a new perspective, a new mindset. And so I've got to get reacclimated to this place. There's a minefield that I'm going back into. And there are minds there that I didn't know were there before. There are issues there that I didn't know was there before because I was used to the old way. And again, as I've already said, in some cases, I was a part of the issues. So now I got to reacclimate myself to this place that I'm going back to. Right? And so you got to be careful. Again, your surroundings may look familiar. Again, I've already said this. You may go back to people and you go, I know you, but do you know me? I know who you are, but I've been changed now. I've been spending some time with God, so you may not know me anymore. But I got to get reacclimated to this place. And I got to watch this before I move to the next note. I got to learn how to navigate an old space in a new way. I got to learn how to move in this old place that I used to be in, but I got to move in a new way because I'm not the person that I used to be. I'm not the same person y'all remember before. You know my name, but you don't know me anymore. And so when I go back to that old place that I used to hang out, where I used to run around the same people I used to run with, again, it's an old place, but I'm moving different now. And so I've got to know how to navigate this space in a different way. I hope that's making sense to y'all. The next note here is I say, remember that God changed you so that you can be a change agent. So even as you're going back to that place that you used to be in, even as God is sending you back to that place, he's sending you back with a different mission. So before we were there, we were just there. We were living our life. We were doing our thing. We were just there. But God pulls you out and he isolates you and he separates you and he says, I'm going to clean you up and I'm going to use you for my services. Now, when you go back there, you have a different mission. You have a different call on your life. You're called to do something different now. In this season of my life right now, again, being a preacher and a pastor, there are people who grew up with me. Some who knew exactly where I was going to end up. But some are looking at it like, oh my God, I never thought. I told you about that job that I had to quit. I often bring up the fact that there are people on that job that I'm sure that are stunned because they knew a completely different person than I am right now. They are stunned like, I can't believe he's a preacher now. He's a pastor right now. But again, and most of them I really connect through social media. But God makes sure that I know that you cannot dim your light because people knew you back then. I'm sending you back into their lives in a different capacity. You may have to save somebody. You may have to rather lead some of these people to salvation. Y'all forgive me for saying that because I can't save nobody. I didn't save myself. You may have to lead these people back into salvation. You may have to lead these people to Christ. Those people who knew you when your language wasn't that great. Those people who knew you when your behavior wasn't that great. God may be calling you to go to those people and lead them to Christ. And so again, God didn't change you just to change you. He changed you so that you can be a change agent. Maybe those people receive it, maybe they don't, but somebody is going to come to know Jesus because of you. And again, that's just not just reserved for the preacher and the pastor. That's reserved for anybody under the sound of my voice that God not only saves, but he takes you and he cleans you up. You are called to be a change agent. As the Bible says, you are called to let your light shine so that men may see but glorify your Father in heaven. And so God didn't change you just to change you. He did it so that you can be a change agent. Next note here. Don't be offended if you aren't received right away. Again, y'all, personal testimony. I had to accept the fact that when I was called into the ministry, there were people that knew me that said there's no way God called him. There are people who knew me and they said, no, I don't believe God called him to preach. Now, these were people in church who read their Bibles and read the account of the Apostle Paul, and they accepted the fact that God could change somebody who was persecuting and killing Christians, but he couldn't change me. Right. He couldn't change somebody like me. I was too hard of a project for God, but they were reading the words of somebody that God had picked up on the Damascus Road and cleaned them up and turned them around. It's amazing how we do. Don't be offended if you're not received right away. So when you come out, understand that you're going to be moving different. You're going to be talking different. You may even have to tell some people, I don't do that anymore. And they may not receive you because they may say, oh, you think you're better than me. And one of the things I like to tell people about us when we're saved, especially when we're cleaned up for a service, I say we're not better than anybody. We're just better off. We're better off because we're in his service now. Before we were in the service of the enemy, but we're better off now because we're in his service. Now, I'm not better than you. I'm better off than you. But listen, some of the same stuff I got is available to you too. God will use you too. And so we have to make sure people understand that. But you can't be offended if you're not received right away. So when you're coming out of this isolation piece and you're going into that, you're going back to those people at times. They may reject you. They may say, we don't want none of this. Oh, here you come with that Bible. We don't want any of this. Don't tell me about Pastor Jackson podcast. I don't care about what Pastor Jackson got to say. They may not receive you right away. You got to be all right with that. Got to be all right with that. Because again, I'll say, thank you, Holy Spirit. I'll say it like this. Some of the places that we were received in before God changed us, we should be ashamed that we were received so readily in some of those places. We should be ashamed of some of the places that we were welcomed. We should be ashamed of some of the places that we went and the party didn't start till we got there. We should be ashamed that we were at the center of wrong. And so God pulls you up and he pulls you out and he turns you around. But then God says, go back, and they may not receive you right away. But that's all right, because it's better to be rejected for doing what God says than to be received for doing what you said. I hope that made sense to y'all. Let me hurry on here so that we can get out of here very quickly. Last section here. So here it is, y'all. Lessons learned must become lessons applied. And so one of the things that we did a Wisdom Wednesday a couple of times on it, And we even did a sermon series at the church, Things I Learned in the Struggle. And one of the things that I'm always trying to stress people is when you're going through stuff, whatever the situation may be, when God is calling you and he's taking you through stuff or whatever you learn, make sure that you apply the lessons learned. It makes no sense, my brother, my sister, to learn a lesson and never let it affect how you move. It makes no sense to learn a lesson in life and never let it affect how you apply it to your life and how you live your life and how you move. I've often said that wisdom is simply applied knowledge. So just because people know better don't mean they'll do better. It makes no sense to go through and learn all those lessons in life and still go back and just continue to do things like you don't know any better. So lessons learned must become lessons applied. So when you're coming out, whatever God taught you in that time of isolation and separation, make sure that you're applying it to your life. Next note here. What you learned in isolation must now be implemented. So that supports the last point I made. What you learned in isolation must now be implemented in your life. It doesn't make any sense for you to go through that and not put it in your life. So one of the things that we do very quickly, I'll tell you this before we get to the last note on today, because we're making really good time. One of the things that I try my best to do, I try my very best to do when I'm teaching, when I'm preaching, and I often say it like this, I try to give you a word with handles so that you can pick it up and carry out of the church with you or carry it away from Bible class with you. But I try to make the Bible not only plain so that people can understand it, but relevant to their lives. Now, the one thing that Pastor Jackson won't do is I will not water down the word, and I will not fill it with a bunch of catchphrases, because I see a lot of that being done in preaching and teaching these days, and I don't think it really helps people. I think we need to make it clear what God said in the word and make it as relevant as possible to say this is how this applies to your life without throwing a bunch of other things in there. And so what we learn in isolation, what we learn during that time with God, it's got to be implemented in your life. Don't let it be a situation that God pulls you out of some places and he separates you and he says, I'm going to consecrate you. And then you go back and you don't put anything into practice that God has been teaching you. That you don't take anything from that time that you spent with God, getting close to God, being in prayer and meditation, being in your word. And then you get up and you go back to them same places that you used to go back to before and act like God ain't did nothing. So again, y'all, what we learn in isolation must be implemented. Last note here, again, making really good time. Last note here. Remember that God is not dropping you off or deserting you here. Remember that when God pulls you out and he pulls you into the promise, again, we're going to talk about that next week. I got some scripture to go with that because we're talking about coming out. Remember that when God pulls you out, he takes you into that promise, because we started this series talking about the children of Israel on their way to the promised land. Know that God is not dropping you off or deserting you. Know that when God pulls you out and he cleans you up and he consecrates you and he isolates you and he takes this long walk with you, when you go back to where God is sending you, God is not just dropping you off. He doesn't have a plans to desert you. This is simply, as I told you all last week, I believe I said, listen, it's the ending of one thing. It's the beginning of something else. When you're going into isolation, it's the ending of one thing, but it's the beginning of something else. So God is simply saying, okay, now that you've gone through your training and your consecration, and by the way, we may have to do all this over again at some point. God says, I am not leaving you here. I am not turning you loose. This is not a trainee program that you would go through on your job where, again, they train you with the mindset that we're going to turn you loose and let you be to your own devices. God is not dropping you off nor deserting you when you come out of isolation. He's simply preparing you to go into the next phase. But he's not going to leave you. He's not going to leave you by yourself. He's still going to be with you. And so you got to understand that when you're coming out of this isolation thing, again, God is preparing you, but there's no way that God can use you and desert you at the same time. So he's preparing you so that he can use you, and he's still going to be with you as you journey on into this new space. And we'll talk about that on next week. That's all the time that we got this week. We'll talk about that more on next week. That'll be our last Monday morning discipleship for the summer. And we'll close it up on next week so that you'll have everything that you need, everything that God has given me to give to you, so you can understand this isolation piece and this taking this long walk with God. But I want to make sure that you all understand that you got to let God do what he does. You got to let him clean you up, and then you got to let him use you. So let's leave it right there. We'll pick it up again on next week. That's all the time we got for Monday morning discipleship. Again, I pray that you all were blessed by what we had to share on today. Very quickly, let me give you our tag, as we always do. If you'd like to keep up with us, the best way to do that, check us out at the ministry's website, www.krjministries.org. Again, www.krjministries.org. If you'd like to purchase any of our written works, we mentioned that book, Where's My Change, or any of our other works, you can go to the publishing website, www.krjpublishing.com. Again, www.krjpublishing.com. Stop by there. We do believe that you will be blessed. Listen, wherever you listen to this podcast, we encourage you, hit that subscribe button. Wherever you're checking us out, wherever you're streaming us, hit the subscribe button so that you know when new episodes become available. Please, my brother, my sister, share it on your social media timeline. If you're being blessed by what we're sharing here on the Purpose and Beyond podcast, we would appreciate you shouting us out and telling somebody, go over there and subscribe to that podcast. It will be a blessing to you. Listen, if you're watching us on the video side, Monday morning discipleship at night, you're watching on the Kelly R. Jackson YouTube channel, Kelly R. Jackson Ministries, rather, YouTube channel, please hit that subscribe button there as well. We encourage you to do that. Again, share it on your social media timeline. Tell somebody, go check out the video so you can get some of the notes that Pastor Jackson have with the podcast. And we would definitely appreciate you for doing that as well. Listen, if you'd like to become a sponsor of this podcast, you can do so by visiting www.patreon.com/purpose and beyond. Check out the different levels of sponsorship that we do offer, some as little as $5 a month. We would definitely appreciate you becoming a sponsor of this podcast. If you don't want to do the entire Patreon thing, we do have exclusive content over there. But if you don't want to do that, you can just sow into the ministry by visiting www.krjministries.org/donate. And there you can just sow into the ministry if you want to do that. If the podcast is enough for you, you can even do that as little as $5 a month. All major credit cards and debit cards are accepted there as well. I always make sure that I invite you all to come to church with us each and every Sunday at For the Kingdom Christian Church, where I am the pastor. We stream our services every Sunday morning at 10 a.m. sharp. Every Sunday morning at 10 a.m. our services stream on our Facebook page. Find us at FTK Church or search For the Kingdom Christian Church. They also stream on our YouTube channel. Search For the Kingdom Christian Church. And you can subscribe to our channel there as well. Join us for worship service every Sunday morning at 10 a.m. If you are in the Detroit area, check out our Facebook page. You can find out where you can come by in person to worship with us. As we always say, we would love to see your face in the place. That's all the time that we have for our Monday morning discipleship podcast. I pray that you all were blessed by what we had to share on today. God bless you and God keep you is my prayer as always. And we'll see you all on next time. Be blessed.